Okay, so this is a brief video just about the concept of subversion. This week's readings are ones in which you can see that the writers who are working from a model story have had some sort of, like, maybe you could call it a disagreement with like how the original story was portraying things, and wants to in some ways correct or amend some sense of what their philosophy toward things related to the story's concept is about. And so that's what we mean when we talk about subversion, like taking some meaning and flipping it on its head in some way. And the key to doing this, if you want to try it yourself, is you have to find a balance in how you feel about the model story that you disagree with. On the one hand, sure, you disagree with it in some way and you want to change its meaning, but also you have to have at heart some affinity for the writing. You have to have some deep understanding of how it's written, because without those things, you won't understand what there is to change about the story to change its meaning. Remember this about stories. I had put this in a definition in an earlier video. The idea that stories are not just a sequence of scenes, but they're also meant to create a kind of vivid and continuous dream for readers, and they're implicitly philosophical. And that implicitly philosophical part plays in here. It's your job when you read a model story that you're going to be influenced by to try to suss out, like, what is it trying to say? What is its kind of implicit worldview? And then ask yourself, how do I want to project some different worldview in the version of the story that I tell? And the answer to how you do that is, of course, with different craft elements. I went through 6 of them in that video a few weeks back. So you might think at first about those and how to mess with those. So it's really about craft elements and worldview, those 2 things. And you need to sort of like think about both with as much rigor as possible as you consider what's possible in subversion. So, for example, point of view. Think about the point of view for the fairy tales you read, the original fairy tales, that is Cinderella and Bluebeard. In each example there, you have a point of view that's very generic. It's kind of third person, distant. That narrator seems to have some judgment that they're making about the characters, about the princesses who are being described. There's a sense that those narrators are maybe judging those characters for some of their actions. The change in point of view to Carter's story or to Donahue's story is to first person. And what happens when we move from third person, generic in that way that the fairy tales have, to this first person that gives us the thoughts of the princesses or the maidens, is that we're invited to empathize with those characters in ways that we were not necessarily invited to empathize with them before. And so that move in point of view creates a different allegiance that we as readers have to the characters over the narrator. The narrator and the character are sort of one and the same now, and we're invited then to see what happened in a different light. We had also talked about scenes as a potential craft element, right? Well, think about how either Carter or Donahue have, let's imagine, mapped out what the scenic structure is of the fairy tales that they're subverting, and which scenes have they omitted and which scenes have they added that didn't originally exist. That's a way you can think about subversion. It's like by removing a scene, you sort of divert our attention away from what that scene had. So, for example, in The Tale of the Shoe, there is no scene in which we see the arrival of some wicked stepmother and some wicked stepsisters. That's not part of that plot at all. That scene has been removed. And in so doing, Donahue has focused our attention elsewhere. And in that way, then, you could say that the story, the original fairy tale, has been subverted. Third, you might think about pacing. Like, where did the original fairy tale, in either case of what you read for this week, where does it slow down? What does it show us most definitively and slowly? And what does it sort of gloss over? Often, as a reader of a story that we want to subvert, we're frustrated at a certain moment in the story where something we think is important is glossed over. And so in our subverted version of it, we'll slow down the pace at the point at which the original author sped by something, right? Or the opposite. Maybe there was close attention paid to something that we think should have been brushed by. So thinking carefully about where you think what about how a story that you're modeling your own after is paced can do a lot of work for you in terms of what kind of subversion is possible. Fourth, this one goes back a little bit to point of view, but the question of interiority, like, whose heads are we inside, and what about that person's way of thinking do we get to know? Think of that both in terms of the original story and in terms of the Donahue and Carter's subversions. Like we really get to know what's in the head of these narrators, the princesses themselves, the maidens themselves. And knowing that information changes much about our sense of the story's philosophy, right? You might look for passages in which that's happening in the original versus in the subversion in different ways. And that could be something you write about or something that you imitate in your own craft exercise for the week. So I've only talked about 4 different craft elements that we could talk about as being subverted. There are any number of other ones. You might remember that I originally talked about 6. It's your job as you read these stories to identify certain things about them that are notable to you, that you either admire or that you would want to change. And the more specific you can get in that way, maybe in the way that I've helped to describe in this video, the more precise you can be in how you were to go about subverting a story, if that's your goal.